All right, welcome back. This is episode 4 of MTMM Radio. I'm going to set my timer here for, I'll give you 12 minutes this time, Ben, just to make sure that anything. What are we going to be talking about today?
Today, I think we're going to talk about the difference between eating a high or low volume of food and what that actually means in terms of high or low amount of calories and the distinction between the two. So again, like I've actually been really enjoying these and being able to break down a lot of the certain topics that you know we do see repeat and repeat and repeat. And this is definitely a big one. There's there's generally always part of people's education when it comes to nutrition is getting them to understand, you know, firstly and foremost, what is a calorie, right? And then secondly, that, you know, volume of food necessarily isn't indicative of how many calories we're actually eating. And so it is the calories that do count at the end of the day more than it is the volume of food, right? So when we're talking about, you know, promoting whole foods and nutritious foods, it's a way of, you know, really being able to increase the amount of volume of food that someone is, you know, able to eat without necessarily, or in most cases, even being able to decrease the amount of calories that they're taking in, right? And I think that sometimes that can be a bit of a tough nugget to wrap your head around. You know, some people come to us saying, look, I don't know, you know, why I can't lose weight. I only eat, you know, a little amount or a small amount. And then you actually look at the small amount of things that they're eating. And it's like, well, yeah, I understand that you're always hungry because there's no volume, but that doesn't mean that there's no calories, right? So when we think of, you know, contrasting a huge bowl of whatever salad that you want to eat as opposed to, you know, like a fun-sized Mars bar or a couple of Oreos, well, you're going to get more energy, right? More calories out of the small snack than you are going to get from the satiating salad, right?
Yeah, and then if you also compare something like a very large salad to a small handful of nuts. And maybe the salad is loaded with a lot of different things, but still the calorie count of that huge salad could be less than that small handful of nuts. So it just can be pretty deceiving when it comes to how many calories you're actually eating.
Right, and I think that's probably a good point to touch on as well, is just because you might be eating more whole foods and more nutritious snacks, you know, in terms of things like nuts and seeds, as opposed to chocolate bars and donuts and shit like that, there is also too much of a good thing, right? And we can go all into, and we probably will go into how the different macros have different levels of satiation. But I think, you know, primarily we want to sort of break that understanding that I'm only eating a small amount. It's like, well, a small amount of food could still be a large amount of calories. And at the end of the day, depending on your goals, if we're trying to keep you in a deficit or put you into a surplus, it's something that we'll look to manipulate both ways, right?
Yeah. I know it's a lot of times that people come to me saying they're eating really healthy. They're making really smart decisions in terms of what they're eating. But it really does, at the end of the day, come down to how many calories you're eating. And that's where that knowledge and that education of calories and macronutrients becomes really important. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need you tracking your macros all the time, or that you need to become obsessed with the numbers and always be knowing what you're eating. But having a general understanding of what is in the foods that you eat is going to make you a little bit more cautious of, like, okay, maybe I shouldn't have half a cup of almonds because that is a lot of calories. Maybe I should just have a tablespoon and have it with some vegetables or something instead, right?
Put a bit of almond butter on your vegetables, you reckon, Maggie?
No. Well, that's something I probably do, actually.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, a really big part of what we do is based around that education. And so why macros are important, because there's a difference in eating, you know, say 2,500 calories of just carbohydrate as there is to eating 2,500 calories from an appropriate split of protein, carbs, and fats, right? And that's going to have to do with how each of the macros interacts hormonally with your system, the volume of food that you get, like we've mentioned, with those different macros, and also, you know, the satiating factor, right? So if you're just eating, you know, 2,000, 2,500 calories of rice or syrup or something like that, you know, cans of Coke, and inherently, you know, most of the stuff that we go on to mention, which is why we tend to try to avoid processed food for the main part, is because it is so much easier to really blow out your calorie goal when you are, you know, consuming and drinking hidden calories, right? Like can of Coke, 52, 55 grams of sugar. You know, it's the equivalent to 250 grams of sweet potato, right? And if you had to choose between the two, 250 grams of sweet potato is a pretty decent serve, right? So if you're having 2 cans of Coke a day, and then you're having that to wash down whatever else you're eating, it's not hard to see how that might all add up by the end of the day. Can of Coke's not going to be all that satiating either, right? And when we look at that against, fats as well. Okay, well, fats, tend to have a bad rap. Calorically, they are higher than carbohydrates or protein, but they keep us feeling so much more satiated for so much longer, right? So, okay, you're going to get more calories from eating more fat, but you're probably less likely to need to keep eating or need to snack again in half an hour because your stomach's empty. Yeah.
Right. A little bit more satiated. What about eating, like in terms of eating excess whole foods, like eating more whole foods in terms of calories than eating processed foods in general? Like, do you think that there's, like you were just talking about how you'd probably be less satiated if you have something that's highly processed versus something that's whole. But do you think that eating in excess of calories for whole foods or getting more calories from whole foods is going to be more detrimental than eating less calories from processed foods? Does that make sense?
Let me just try to compute the question.
Okay, let me start again.
No, I got you. No, I get what you mean. I think, look, at the end of the day, the goal should be really to be minimizing the amount of processed foods you're eating. And regardless of the IIFYM, if it fits your macros, go for it kind of phenomenon, which we know is not exactly true, because there are things that aren't considered in, just looking plain at the macros. And that's making sure you're diversifying things like your fats and we tend to see as well with processed food, it can trigger or lead to like more things like binges and stuff like that. That is just basically unheard of when it comes to whole food, right? The thing you got to keep in mind with processed foods too is that it's a sales pitch, right? And food is legitimately chemically engineered to try to get you to try to eat more food. Some of the feedback that we get from new clients when they've coming large off what is largely a processed food diet, is that the food that they're cooking themselves tastes pretty bland. And it's like, yeah, it's not covered in syrup, right? That must be different, and therefore it can take a little bit of time for the palate to change and taste buds to mature and stuff like that. But it's not to say that, we completely outlaw the consumption of, any kind of processed food at all. Again, the main aim of coming onto program is to learn how to integrate, a balance between, okay, taking steps to progress towards your goal, which is generally going to be health and performance based and body composition based. But also that doesn't mean you can never have a burger or you can't have ice cream or you never have another beer, right? Because again, we're after sustainability over long periods of time. We can circle back to the consistency of perfection. But knowing that you can have processed foods occasionally if you want them and choosing not to is a much healthier mindset than being told you're not allowed to eat pizza, right? You're never allowed to have the burger. And if there's nothing for you to rebel against, then you're going to spend more time on program, right? I think that's fundamental difference. To answer your question deliberately, of course you can blow out your calories from just whole foods, okay? Which is why, it's important for most to get into the habit of like understanding what a portion size is and what a serving size is of cashews or almonds, like you mentioned, because if you have a handful of cashews every time you walk past the cupboard, over the course of the day, you could easily do, 1,000, 2,000 calories just eating, waiting for your food to warm up or, get your meal prep finished. So there is too much of a good thing for sure. But in terms of, and I think like vegetables are probably the best example, you are going to get sick of chewing before the amount that your broccoli can blow out your profile is really going to make a huge impact, right? And it's not going to lead to the same sort of binge that potentially, a donut might, or like one scoop of ice cream suddenly turns into the panan or something like that, right? I don't think I've ever sat down with a client who's like, it's been a terrible week, like I just can't stop eating zucchini, and you just, again, because we are able to manipulate that volume versus calories in correlation there. If I always say to my clients, if you're still hungry after you've met full profile and you want to eat more vegetables, have at it, right? And if it turns out that we're doing that every day, then we need to adjust your profile accordingly. But really, the impact is going to be quite minimal, right?
What about those processed foods that are advertised as being low in calories, like things like those fake syrups or those calorie-free chocolate spreads, that sort of thing? What do you think about those?
I think there's a massive pseudo health industry within processed foods, right? And it stems past things like muesli and quick oats and stuff like that, and it does get into the 0 calorie stuff. And essentially, the real rule of thumb is, you look at the ingredients and you can't pronounce half of them, or you never heard of them. Like, it's probably a sign we generally don't want to eat them, right? And again, that might take a little bit of getting used to, and if we're using a little bit of Zevia, for an example, if someone's drinking a heap of Coke and we're putting them onto something like Zevia to kind of satiate that habit or that behavior slowly and wean them off, is very different to, just letting them guzzle and guzzle and guzzle, right? So is it preferable? Probably. Is it great? Probably not. Are we using it as a stepping stone to improve? Well, that's the important thing to consider, right? What we do want to be careful of is, just because, again, it fits your macros or it doesn't seem to have any macros, doesn't mean that it can't contain anything that's potentially, not great for us. Additives, preservatives, anything that's edible that doesn't have a name, that just has a compilation of letters and numbers. You just don't know really what that's going to do to your digestive tract, right? So if we look at things even like trans fats, that are chemically engineered fats that aren't naturally occurring, the body really struggles to use those, right? To break those down. And if we can't break things down and utilize it as energy, we're going to store it, right? So especially things like gums and additives and preservatives, it can just have the potential to just wreak havoc on your whole digestive system. And if anything is making digestion hard, if it's creating inflammation, if it's the body's forced to mount a response every time you eat this sort of stuff, it's doing more damage than probably eating the actual honey or the actual maple syrup would do, right? And just taking the extra hit on the calories. Because anything that's, if we're trying to create an optimal, environment for body recomposition, whether that be fat loss or muscle gain, if we're expending a heap of energy just to try to digest the things that we're eating, it's a misdirection of resources, right?
And I think that, just on time. I think that one of the really cool things about all this is that when we do bring clients on who have come from eating a very high processed diet, and we slowly start to transition them into a whole foods based diet, they enjoy it and they want to continue with that
Right.
whole foods based diet rather than keep going back to the processed foods diet. So that goes to show how powerful the feeling that you get from the foods that you're eating is. It's magical.
Well, I think that's a twofold effect, right? The first fold effect is usually the word diet sparks fear in most people, right? And it kind of initially is going to create, or evoke these feelings of restriction and stuff like that. And that is definitely a mold that we're trying to break. And we're trying to redefine, the term diet to actually include everything that you consume. And so if it's everything that we consume, then there's no being on or off diet, right? It's about learning to, okay, well, if this is all the things I'm eating, how do I make this fit properly so that I can progress forward towards my goals? But I think it's that first 2 weeks is almost like a relief, when we have clients on program and, okay, we've brought their calories down, but they're actually able to eat, 2 or 3 times as much volume of food. And the feedback we get is like, I can't meet the profile yet, it's too much food. And it's like, I don't understand how I get to eat all this food and I'm losing weight. We're so conditioned to think we have to be on real poverty macros to be able to move forward towards our goals. And it's just not the case, right? So, and that never, like 3 years in, and that still like brings a smile to my face when people get that. And it's kind of similar to smoking, right? Like if we can get you through the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks, allow your taste buds to change, really start to work and develop those behaviors, let your body adjust to eating more protein, eating more fiber, etc., then you're right. They get that feeling of like, I feel pretty unbelievable pretty quickly, you know? And why wouldn't you want to keep doing something that makes you feel good, So yeah, I think like that's probably the key takeaways is that, you can overdo the good stuff, but it's probably going to be better off to overdo good stuff in the long run than it is to go the other way.
Yeah, right? And the bad stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks. We'll catch you.
No dramas. See you on the next one.
Bye.